Okay, looks like we're on here. Welcome to the 4D Method 4D user group. Today is June 30th, 2020. This is meeting number 44. Thanks for joining us. It's been a while since our last meeting in March, and a lot's happened since then, and hope everyone is staying well out there around the world, and being careful considering everything with the virus and whatnot. But today we're here to talk about 4D. We'll start by talking about 4D Method, this user group. We'll get some 4D news from Jim and Diane in California. We'll talk a little bit about the Summit 2020, do a recap of what became the digital experience. We'll get the 4D iNug e-digest from Ed Hammond. We'll talk about some of the recent articles from the blog, 4D blog, that is. And then we'll move on to our special topic, modularizing collection and entity list boxes. We've got Kirk Brooks and Guy Algot that's going to handle that for us today. We're going to be attempting a bit of a more of a round table style today. Today is our first swing at that. We'll talk a little bit more about it later on. We'll handle any questions and answers, and then we'll talk about our next meeting on August 19th, 2020. Hope to see you then. So my name is Brent Raymond. I organize the 4D Method user group. Our website is 4dmethod.com. We've got an extensive selection or a history of these meetings on there. We can be reached at 4dmethod@gmail.com. What we're trying to do with this user group is to bring together a scattered community of developers and users of 4D applications, 4D software around the world. We use video conferencing, like in this case, Zoom, for meetings to allow people to participate from anywhere. I remember when Zoom was an adventurous and experimental option for these meetings, and now my kids use it, who are young, for their schoolwork even. Became very popular with this quarantine. So we record all the meetings and presentations to be viewed again and shared with others on the 4D Method YouTube channel. And what we really are trying to do is, in between summits and trainings and that kind of stuff, we're trying to provide fresh new content and exposure for users and developers everywhere, 4D developers and users of 4D applications, to show off the applications that they use. So thanks again for joining, and I'm going to kick over to Jim and Diane to talk a little bit about what's new with 4D.
Okay, thank you, Brent. It's going to be mostly me talking today. Diana's in the meeting and paying close attention. So on behalf of the 4D team, I'd like to welcome you all to, did you say meeting 44, Brent? That's amazing. Yeah. Especially if we started at meeting 1. That's where that time went fast. Yeah, and like Brent said, I hope you all are staying safe and healthy in either your work environment, your home environment, and at your family as well as this course. So our thanks to Brent and Ed for, especially for now in this time, continuing to organize these meetings and lining up interesting and cutting edge presenters as always. And today we have two good ones in Kirk Brooks and Guy Algot. Yeah, modularizing is a tough word to say. Modularizing collections and entity.
Did I pull that off? Yeah.
It doesn't roll off the tongue, but I know exactly what you mean there. So it should be a really interesting presentation, and we're looking forward to that. So a quick news about the state of 4D. I could probably take up the entire meeting talking to you about what's happening at 4D. I'll try to make it brief. In the US, at least, we're all still working from home. A few of the staff are going into the office for essential tasks for the most part, like banking and mail and things like that. But in Silicon Valley, we're still not open very much. Most of the technology industries are still closed. Most people are working from home, and we don't know when that's going to change. So we're following the guidelines of our local county, which is Santa Clara County. So we'll see how that goes. It's a little bit different story for our colleagues in 4D France and 4D Germany. They are back in their offices now fully. Those offices are open, and the staff is going into the office, but they're not quite in the same situation with the virus that we're in the US. So I think we're all fortunate. Everyone on this call probably feels fortunate that we're in an industry where we can work from home and be productive. Of course, we know there's a lot of people who are not so fortunate. So we think about those people all the time and count our blessings that we can do this. 4D itself in the US and internationally, our sales and support services, professional services remain strong. We're having a good quarter here in the US, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's true. I can tell personally that our customer communications are probably better than they've ever been right now. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that people are home. They're not traveling, they're not on the road, they're not in the office where there can be some distraction sometimes. So we're getting really close with our client base right now, which is really great and the thing that I most like about my job. So that said about 4D, you probably noticed we've been busy in the last 4 months or so, as Brent mentioned, converting the summit to a digital experience was a major undertaking for us. And first and foremost, I want to thank all of the summit sponsors. They all had an opportunity to say no when we were moving to digital experience and not sponsor, but every one of them chose to continue with their sponsorship. And I think that now they're seeing the benefit of that because all their logos are on the video and the videos are being watched. And I'll tell you about that a little bit more. In addition to the sponsors, I wanted to thank the non-4D staff and the 4D staff who were scheduled to present at the summit and who did record your sessions and put them on the summit digital experience site. So that means a lot to us. I know it's not easy to do that, especially when you're doing that from home. The recordings are very professional for the most part, and we're really happy with the way that turned out. As you know, we're providing free access to all the summit content. We refunded all the summit registrations to everyone internationally. And not only the summit's up there, we developed a portal to view those videos, 45 to 50 breakout sessions, around 40 hours of video recordings. I hope you all are getting a chance to watch those. I know that it's tricky sometimes when you're working from home, but there's a lot of good content up there and it will be up there for a long time. So take your time. I would hope you would watch the opening keynote, the technical keynotes, and especially the business keynote to find out where we're going with e-learning and other marketing events like that. And it's been successful for us. We've had 2,600, that's 2,600 unique attendees to our site as of last week. As you know, we get about maybe 200 people at the summit in the US and around 300 in Europe at the Paris summit there. So that's about 500 people. So that's 2,600 people. That's a lot more than we would see person to person. And we're glad that the word is getting out there. The summits are being disseminated, the summit sessions are being disseminated. People seem to be interested in watching them. And we're now working on getting subtitles into those summits. So the ones that are not in English are getting English subtitles. The ones that are in English are getting Spanish and Portuguese subtitles. So that's happening now as we speak, and they'll be up on our website soon. I know Brent has some slides about the summit as well. But moving away from that into our software releases, we haven't missed a beat as far as that goes. On June 4th, we released version 18.2, which is the latest iteration of the LTS or long-term support cycle of 4D. And in mid-July, or the third week of July actually, we'll release the latest version of our feature releases, which will be R3. Right now we're on R2, R3 is in beta, but it should be out in about 3 weeks. And if you want to see the features that are in R3, I encourage you to see the blog, visit the blog, blog.4d.com. I would say that V18 R3 is probably our most feature-rich release version so far. That's going all the way back to V15. There's some major stuff in there, including like 40 new templates for the 4D for iOS galleries, a lot more on object-oriented programming and Write Pro, etc. So there's a lot of stuff in the 18R3. And last point for me is discuss.4d.com. I know Ed will be talking about this later in the show. I want to, first off, we put a lot of effort into this site, and I want to thank you all for moving your important discussions to discuss.4d.com. We'll keep the iNug open for now, but I think that in the future that discuss.4d.com will have better community support, better support from our 4D engineers and technical support folks as well. Yeah, the transition was fairly smooth as far as I can see, and I think that the whole user interface of discuss.4d.com is pretty smooth. So that's about all from me, Brent. I could keep going for a while, but I think I don't want to take up all the time for this meeting. I wish you all a great 4th of July weekend. Stay safe. If you have some downtime, watch some videos from the summit session. And yeah, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thanks, Brent.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
And yeah, I just to be certain, there's a whole ton of great content in the digital experience, but there are a couple of demos of videos that you should really make certain of watching if you are if you've been involved in 4D development. Of course, it's a bit more on the technical side. If you're just a 4D user, it's probably a bit heavy to watch. But the first one is from Laurent Hainaut. It's the future of object-oriented development with 4D. It's really taking gigantic steps in the language. Starts with a review of the new variant type in the language, so that the variable can be any kind of type, not just text or long int. You don't have to declare that to begin with. You can put anything in it, which adds a whole ton of great flexibility when you're coding. It looks into, it reviews the new formulas that they've made available. Then he goes into introducing classes, which are a custom defined 4D object type, how to write functions in classes that can be accessed through the new class store using cs.stuff class name. It touches on inheritance, addressing superclasses, checking class instances. All of this is already available to start coding or at least playing with in V18 R3. That's in beta right now. So essentially, you're already working with V19. And in general, all of these features are sure to have a massive impact in new 4D development for years to come. And it certainly sets the stage for what the next video you should certainly not miss. Tagline, the unbelievable is coming. So this is from Laurent Ribardier. And he spends about half the time getting deeper into classes and class inheritance and writing getters and setters and searching in classes that inherit from the data store. So you can extend the 4D data store itself. So you can say this class inherits that table itself, and then you can create alias to fields, calculated fields, kind of trigger that fires each time the record is touched. He shows how these new features then can be exposed in a web application, which gets into the even more unbelievable part of the demo, where he shows off the beginnings of a kind of a WYSIWYG builder for websites, for web applications. I think they're the name hasn't been formalized yet, but it looked like it was something like 4D web forms. There's a new, in the 4D language, there's a new web form object for controlling what interface is displayed in the web app, which is kind of groovy to be able to control that from directly within the 4D code. There's a new session shared object for use when serving web apps, which has the ability to handle authentication and has its own storage for putting information as you're operating within the web application. There's a new event that's called a web event, of all things, where you can react to certain events in the browser, in the web application. It'll let you know what widget is calling the event, is having the event, what kind of event it is. Say the screen is being resized, or certain things are dragged or clicked on. There's a lot left to be exposed for all of these new features, but it is a massive glimpse of what's coming in V19 and in future versions of 4D, and how easy it's going to be to expose great data structures and functionality and business logic on the web from within the 4D language. It's a big adaptation of some of the web technology that they had originally made in previous years, but directly in the 4D language. So pretty incredible stuff. If you watch anything, watch those two videos. And as Jim mentioned, there's a lot of other videos to watch as well, including the full keynote, which is always interesting. They don't always have those readily available for sharing. And this year, this summit, you can go through the entire keynote, each of the segments, and not only look at what's going on with the business, but some of the engineering aspects that they're highlighting for upcoming versions of 4D. In addition to the keynote videos, there are a whole bunch of, I think Jim said over 40 in total. Maybe that's including the keynote, but there's certainly very many English and French technical sessions. So whole ton of material. It's been nice being able to watch those and rewatch those, and I think it's a nice. This could be a foundation even when we are able to meet again, once we're all we've all either already had COVID and are the new race of superhumans, or we get vaccinations. One way or another, this is a great structure for being able to watch the content from the summits. And the videos are tied into the new forum, discuss.4d.com. I'll leave it to Ed to say a little bit more about that, but each of the videos has a link into their own topic in the forum where people can comment, and 4D has been very responsive for responding to questions and comments that people have added in response to the videos, all the videos. So yeah, definitely check that out. All the content from the digital experience and the highlights, and the new forum. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ed to talk about a little bit about the iNug and the new forum and all of that. So, Ed.
Thanks, Brent. Not a whole lot to say here. One day in May, I was getting behind in my digest reading, had probably 10 or so. And then June rolled around and I was still behind. And suddenly there were no messages in the digest because everybody had jumped over to discuss.4d.com. The iNug has been around for a long time, probably the roots in the old CompuServe group. Many times people complained it's hard to post code. We can't include any screenshots or anything else. And finally, I believe discuss.4d.com has got it correct, because instantly all the discussion on the iNug stopped. Everybody's over there now. Go over there. All these links here, don't go to. You can monitor them. There's still a few messages going back and forth for the old timers who have beards like me, but most everybody has moved on. And if you can go to the next slide, I think, Brent, the future is in the forums. When you first log in, there will be a couple of little tutorials to go through. They will give you forum cred. You get little medallions and things, so that basically the forum knows that you know what you're doing, or can at least fake it past the tutorials. Once you got that, then you're free to run off and running. You can monitor whatever you want. I tend to hang out in the English-speaking forums, but there's also a few specialized, let me see if I can pull up what we've got there. There are the forum lists. Well, I don't have to go through all. There's English, French, German, Japanese, Spanish, third parties, beta, feature requests, and the Summit 2020 digital experience. And of course, they will probably be able to add and subtract forums as need be. I will say, I don't know where you got the time to go through all of the digital experience, Brent. I've gained 10 hours of commute time every week in the last 2 months, and I'm still not through 10 of them, I don't think. But with that, I will say, go to discuss.4d.com, join the discussion. It's a marvelous forum. It has everything everyone's wanted for a long time. And if you prefer just to get email about things, you can turn those options on too. I know that every day that I don't go to the forums, it sends me a summary of what's new there. So enjoy the new forums, and we'll be looking forward to a new segment from me sometime in the future, because the e-digest has died. Thanks, Brent.
It lives on in the historical documentation of our previous meetings, but yeah, no, I mean, it's we can all make time one way or another to see all those videos. And not all of you perhaps neglect your families like I do, so I can sit in the basement and watch them, but you know, it's certainly something to have a look at when you get time. But anyways, thanks, Ed, and we look forward to your new segment, Ed Hammond's E-Digest Lives. And now let's talk a little bit about what's been happening in the blog this year. You know, while most of us have been working from home in quarantine, the blog continues to crank out great articles about, like Jim said, most of this is going to show up in 18R3, which I was actually kind of blown away by myself. I had to make 2 slides out of this. So let's talk about a couple of the articles here. First, an intro to object-oriented programming in 4D. Obviously a big deal in R3. There's 2 articles, classes and managing class inheritance. We're all going to need to have a nice step-by-step tutorial and some practice code on how to work with classes. So that's there already in the blog. Project databases, method documentation is back. Okay, earlier with project databases, you couldn't add documentation, which obviously is a problem, especially for things like components, where you need to have some idea of how to use each of the methods. But now it's back, and it's back with a vengeance. They've made it possible to use Markdown with documentation. If you're not familiar with Markdown, it looks kind of like, it can look kind of like what you see on the screen there. It allows some very basic formatting, but oftentimes that's all you really need. It has an added benefit of now when you're sharing your projects publicly or otherwise or privately on Git, you can see all of these descriptions, documentation of the methods and the code pieces directly from within Git, and that's pretty groovy because I think we all know there's seldom enough documentation for all of our code. So now we don't have any excuse. We can make it nice and pretty and formatted and fully legible. Another article, ORDA, breaking news for entity selection methods. In the end, this is an article about how they added the extract function for one. Extract is makes basically a two-step process, now a one-step process for pulling and renaming field values from tables and from related tables directly into a collection instead of pulling it into a collection, pulling all the records into a collection and then saying extract what you want. So that's very nice. It's going to offer a nice opportunity to simplify some code out there if you've already been working heavily with collections and ORDA and whatnot, and also the ability to refresh an entity selection. Again, for anybody that's showing entity selections in list boxes, this is a nice addition so that you can, by code, without any kind of tricks or voodoo or whatever you do to make things work in your applications, it's now you can just say refresh the entity selection and it will automatically refresh what you're seeing in the interface. Should keep moving on some of this because there's just so much, but I have to mention with the next article, there's ORDA, better listbox row selecting. There's a new command, listbox select rows with a plural instead of just row, which was already available. So whenever you're showing a collection list box or an entity selection list box, you can pass in an entity selection or a collection, and it will match the references that you are passing into this new command, and it will manipulate the selection for you in one fell swoop without having to use the current selection that you're setting in the property list and whatnot. It's just a far easier thing to work with than what was available. Moving on, there's an article named Objects Corner, easy sharing and other good news. So the good news is now you can OB copy and collection copy between shared and non-shared objects and collections. So now you don't have to do any special magic to copy read a large object off disk, large collection of information off disk, and then copy it directly into a shared collection, say for configuration for the entire application and whatnot. There was a selection of different code out there for handling that that people had offered because there was a lot of demand for this. I know I had some want for this earlier on, and so it's nice that it's native in the language now. You can also share, you can dictate what object or what collection is, what the locker is, the locker ID for the shared object. So you can say, I want this object to be protected by the same sharing mechanism that other collections or other objects are shared as. And there's a lot of good stuff in this article. You can now better work with objects as a hash table. namely, you don't have to loop through the object to pull out the keys. You can just do OB keys to pull the property names. Likewise, you can do OB values to get a collection of what values are in that object. And you can get the properties and their values in a collection through the OB entries command. So those are all really super handy functionalities that are in that article. If you're doing a lot of work with objects and collections, these are all really welcome language updates. There is now the ability, which is pretty cool, to have multiple web servers in a single 4D instance. In fact, they offer now a web server object where you can reference the web server configurations directly from this web server object, as well as the fact that components can now have their own web servers that won't interfere with the host database's web server. And each of them have their own switches, sort of, to be able to control either the component or the host server web servers. And you can get a collection of all of the web servers that are active and configured using the new command web server list. That's pretty cool. I can tell a lot of people are going to do a few interesting things with that. So there's a new handy command, which I know, at least at the museum, we'll be able to immediately use. Use an off-screen web area. If you're doing anything where you're needing to scrape a web page or leverage web page functionality using execute formula in a JavaScript, execute JavaScript, that kind of stuff, you can use the new web area run off-screen area, pass in an object of what page is supposed to be loaded, and so on and so forth. And there's a new command web area open web inspector where you can actually peek into what's happening in that off-screen web area. Very handy stuff. And finally, there is an update, an ORDA update for, this is very welcome as well, so that when you make changes to your structure, say renaming a relationship or a field name or anything, any changes to the structure, up until now, you would have to restart the standalone application, or if you're doing client-server style development, you'd have to restart your client and your server for those names and structure changes to take effect. So now it's quite groovy. If you're in standalone, it's immediately changed and accessible. If you're in client-server, you just have to restart the client, and then it will repull the structure changes without kicking everyone off the server, which is great. Cool. All right. See some comments in the Zoom chat there. I'll have to catch up on that later, because right now I'm going to launch into our special topic, talking too much. But I'd like to welcome Guy, who's connecting from Edmonton, Canada, and Kirk, who's connecting from San Francisco, California. Both Guy and Kirk are very active 4D community members, to say the least, and also active 4DMethod participants and presenters. Check out from 2016, Guy's presentation on salesperson incentive interface form. And in 2018, Kirk did a demo called Subforms as Dynamic Data Objects, Rethinking the 4D Form. Both of those are certainly worth revisiting. And but today we'll be continuing the discussion about 4D forms. Both Guy and Kirk have been developing 4D solutions since the early days of 4D. Between the two of them, if they allow me to say this, they have, I think, over 60 years of professional 4D experience. That's quite something. That's quite a lot of experience. Today we'll have a little bit of a different style of presentation, part formal slides and code demo, and part open discussion. And I know they'll talk about this a little bit later on, but this is kind of our first swing at a new style of demo, of special topic for 4DMethod. That's kind of like a round table format. So welcome back to the 4DMethod Spotlight, guys. Let's give it a go.
Thanks, Brent.
Thanks, Brent.
Good to be here.
This is going to be the part where Kurt and I just talk over top of each other for the next half hour.
It'll be just like every other Zoom meeting we've been to recently. Let's see. Brent, may I request screen sharing?
Certainly.
So we have a, pardon me while I seem to be unable to do two things at once. So Guy and I have a two-part presentation here. The first thing I want to do is go through a little slideshow that I created to outline this approach to managing list boxes that was inspired by the hints I got from Miyako on various posts, which you may recall from seeing on the forum. And it took me a while to kind of understand some of what Miyako was proposing, and that was really sort of the motivation to create this presentation, because I've had some time to actually kind of try to work through that stuff, and I had to kind of work on it. What I'm hoping I can do is summarize it, or the Guy and I will do is summarize it in a way that gets you going, or kind of get you thinking about things that we can do with list boxes as they relate to displaying collections and entity selections, because it's really quite dynamic. It's very cool. So with that, we're going to get started. And a lot of you probably know that this idea of modularizing things is something that I've been hot on for quite a while. Some of you may have sat through some of my presentations on creating a form controller. I've been a big fan of that since the D13 days. In a way, this is sort of an extension of that, except we're going to focus only on controlling a list box. So the first thing are these 6 properties. If you haven't had a chance to work with a collection or entity selection list box yet, these 6 properties basically define the scope of the list box. And they are, first, there's the object name. And then there are these data sources and the expression that defines the content of the list box. And then finally, there is this meta info expression. This is the one that Miyako really turned me on to, and it's really quite powerful. But we're going to start with simply naming the object. And I'm going to propose to you that you actually think about this and try to adopt a consistent naming system for yourself. Because the first thing we're going to do is name the list box object. From this, now we can create a namespace for that list box. And I do that in the onload code. This could either be in the form, it could be in the list box object itself. Personally, I prefer to put it on the form, but if you put it in the list box object, then the list box object becomes even a little bit more modularized. And as you see, this is pretty simple stuff. I'm just going to create an object with the name of the list box object that I just created. And then I'm going to define these other 5 characteristics. I'm going to have .data, .cur_item, .pos, .selected, and .meta. And these, of course, correspond to the areas in the list box that we just were looking at. So now we have a consistent naming scheme based on the name of the object. And now I can actually create a controller method as well.
Right, so the method name has the same name as the namespace.
Yep, I'm just creating a project method named with this consistent name. So right away you start to see how you really want to make your list box object names something that's relative to the form or the task that is producing. And I simply moved into this project method that initialization code that I had in the form. So now it's all the same namespace. And I can use it within the method, within the project method. I'm going to simply define my list box name, and then I'm going to take advantage of the square brackets that you can use with object notation or with the dot notation. This is also the trick if you haven't encountered this before. If you've been trying to use ORDA in an old project that has spaces and field names or table names, you notice that creates a problem. You can overcome a lot of those problems using the square brackets with the dot naming like this by putting the field name, including its space, into a double quoted string. In this case, I'm simply, since I'm using the consistent namespace throughout, and I named my project method for the namespace, then I can just use the current method name. Get into that. I can save myself a lot of typing. Also, by employing another trick or optimization, which is simply to define a shorthand object and use that shorthand object. And now the initialization back on the form looks like this. All I have to do is call this project method, and my list box is now completely defined. I know I can, and a big benefit to this is that now I can reference any element of this list box, or any of these meta elements of the list box, simply by knowing the object name. I know that the data is displayed in something that's form.name.data. And when I click on something, if I need that, I know that that is form.name.currItem. So now let's add some data. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a very simple collection. Just going to create this little 6-element collection with some names in it. And I'm going to format the list box to display .name, because that is the only thing on there. And then when I run the form, this is what we get. As you see, the collection is displayed in the list box, as we expected. And I included the debugger here to show you how the form.contact_lb object that I associated with the list box, correctly displays all the information. So what about that meta property? Now, I don't know how many of you have tried using this so far, but it's really quite powerful and quite capable. but it's not intuitive.
It's like
So,
it's very similar to like style sheets. So, but like Kurt said, I mean, the first time I tried it, as he did, ended up coloring everything the same. So I think the tip that Miyako gave you really was kind of the add it to the form controller and then access it the way he's going to show here.
yeah, the the key for me was reading the documentation and looking at it. Excuse me, and even after Miyako made a couple of comments on some posts I made, I was still under the impression that what I needed to do was write a function that was going to be evaluated for each row, because that is in fact the mechanism that's going on here. But my thinking is that this function would kind of spit out the correct formatting information, and then that would be associated with the row, and that would give me the correct display. And as Guy said, every time I did that, it would, the code would, and I was able to prove that the code was actually executing, but the display would simply be formatted based on whatever the very last cell was. And it was totally frustrating, and I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. Ultimately, Miyako actually had a little back and forth with me. And I got the idea that what that function needs to do, what that meta info expression needs to return, is a single object. That object can be defined with the formatting information, as we're going to see here in a minute. But that object also needs to be existing someplace. And this is the thing, when I was writing a function, I was basically creating a new object and returning that every time. That isn't what you want to do. You need to have these objects defined and static someplace on your form, and then refer to those static objects. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. But before we get there, it's important to remember that the meta info expression settings that you define are ignored if you use any of the other style settings that can also be defined for the list box. And those are the style expression, the font color expression, and the background color expression. Those particular properties, I guess, or attributes of the list box relate more directly to when we were the options we had before, where you could define an array that would define the, like the font color or the background color for each row of the list box. As we came forward, then those things turned into these style expressions, font color expressions, background expressions. If you're still using those, fine. But if you want to use the meta info expression, which allows you to define all those things in one place, then you're going to want to take out the references to that.
Yeah, and those are all in the property editor when you're looking at the list box.
So to actually use this, what I do is I create a collection in the meta property. And then I define a default style as the 0 element. And then I define some other styles. And the thing is, these are now static definitions. So I don't have to compute these definitions for each row. All I have to do is look at each row and decide which definition to return. And that's the difference. And that's the thing that it took me a long time to get, is that I'm not calculating a new style every time. I do that ahead of time, like I do here. When I display each row, all I have to do is calculate which style to choose. So using that in the method that we've built so far, define 3 styles. And so now I'm going to use my controller method to evaluate what it's going to do. So to make this work, I need to add a return expression. I need to add some basic error protection in the oops. Pardon me, let me see if I can back that up.
One more.
Yep.
That's a really good tip about the precedence of the styling expressions. I'm sure that can be a bit maddening if you're trying to set the meta info and expression and still getting the same result because it's being overridden.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one of those gotchas that you'd be like, why isn't this working?
Mm-hmm.
So that can definitely be one of those things that catches you.
Yep. I have my display set up incorrectly to show that. Actually, this is an important point though. So I'm going to break the fourth wall, and we're going to go back here to. I'm sorry, this is my own clumsiness with Keynote, and I'm having to act this like this. But this is the point that we're making here. So the change to the method that I introduced was the basic error checking is adding this form equals null. This method only works in the context of a form. So if it's ever called and form is null, there is nothing else to do. And then by convention, I'm deciding that if I call it without any parameters, then what this should do is return this meta info expression. So now I'm going to go get my list box object. And I'm going to make sure that I have, again, some more error checking here. I'm going to make sure I have the meta expression defined. And then I can use this. And the context, when called in this context, this refers to the specific row, or which is either an entity or it's the collection object that is being displayed. Okay, it's exactly the same scope and context as using this to define what's displayed in the column. So now I can just, and this is just a really trivial little thing. It's like if this name is my name, then I'm going to use meta 1. And if this name begins with a J, I'm going to use meta 2. And if it's anything else, I'm just going to return the default, which is meta 0.
And for anyone that's not familiar with the new usage of this, as it's being processed on a row-by-row basis, this is either the object or the entity that's being shown in that row at that time. So the way that you get to each of the properties or the values, the field values, is this dot something something.
Yeah, there's one of the examples in the shared repository. I had used sort of our initial starting point when Brent and Kurt and I started talking about this, and so I've got an example there which shows the 3 different sort of ways of handling the data. And so if you've never kind of dealt with the entity selection, you can look at the arrays, the current selection, and then the entity selection, and you can see where that it's 3 examples produce the exact same result, but they all use the different method.
So to implement using this, all I have to do now is drop the name of my method into the meta info expression. And then when I run the list box, here are the results. So as you see, when it hits my name, it uses the format I defined. When it hits a name that begins with a J, then it puts them in red and italic. And if none of those things are true, then it just uses the default. So the crucial thing here is that we're using one name for several things. And that doesn't mean they are all the same thing. So I'm using contact underscore LB as the object name of the list box object. I'm defining it as a property in form, turning it into a form object. And I'm using it as the method that is called for meta info expression. 4D is fine keeping up with these things. But it's important that for you to understand how I'm using the same name for 3 different things here. So what this does is establishes an approach for managing the key elements. I've got a naming convention. I can make a single method to use as a list box controller. I can define the scheme for the meta info expression. I've got a scheme for identifying the contents. I can add data to the list box simply by setting the .data property. You can update or replace the meta info expression as may be required. And the entire scheme is managed by a single method. And with that, I'm going to throw this over to my friend Guy to do a little demo of the stuff that we just talked about.
Yeah, do we want to do that now, Kurt, or do we want to do that at the end?
Why don't you walk through that, and then we'll come back and I'll and I'll extend the idea a little bit.
Okay.
If that's okay. I mean, are you ready?
Yeah, no, I am. Yeah, I was just thinking that we would might want to show it at the end, but that's fine.
Now let's just hammer this nail in really hard.
And okay, Brent, go ahead, Brent.
Oh, I was just gonna, a little ad lib that I can't express how important it is to fall into some kind of a regular practice of naming the current selected item, the current selection, those kind of configurations in your list boxes in some kind of similar way, so that you can more easily track and recall what those settings are as you're doing the development. That's just a very good practice to have one way or another, no matter what you call it. But make it uniform so that you don't go completely mad with the new settings.
Yeah, and the naming's important, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, the first time you make a form and you have 2 or 3 different list boxes on there, and they've all got, they're all entity selections or different views of the same table. It gets very, very difficult to keep track of.
So Brent, can you give me control to share here?
Sure. If you do share screen at the bottom.
Is it good to go?
Mm-hmm, should be.
Okay, there we go. Okay, got that.
Nice.
Okay, so I'm just going to create a standard form here, and I've put a list box. Simple. This database that I'm using, by the way, this is what's up on the Git. So everything that you see here in the Explorer will be available if you want to run through the code yourself. So we're going to go to our Kurt, is it okay if I just use the contact LB in the context here that you've got it?
Sure.
Okay. So when you pull this out, actually, let me get my properties list. So as Kurt mentioned, we're using the entity selection. So you want to set your data source for that. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see everything here. There we go. Okay, so this is going to be our form.contact. You've got your contact list box, which is the method that's already been set up that Kurt showed earlier. So we'll just show that here. So there's the code that Kurt outlined in his demo, and this is sort of your controller. This is where all of your code is located. Your error checking. Go ahead.
Can you make the font a little bit bigger on there?
You betcha. Better?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's better.
Okay. So this is the just to save a little bit of time here. This is the method of with kind of what the presentation that Kurt ran through. So everything is there. So we're going to assign. Oops, we don't want the form examples. I'm going to go back to my example. Did I close it? Oops. Okay. Now something happened here. There we go. Okay. Now, one thing I noticed about 18 is there's a pause on the Mac when you click into the property list, which can be annoying. Object name. So we need to make this our contact LB. And then as we talked about the other properties, we've got down here, we've got our current item position, and our selected items. So in that case, we're going to assign our form, which is our form object, the contact list box, and then the properties that were set up in the form, the current item, the position, and the selected. So I'll go back to my sample form here. Current item, and our current item position, and our selected item. And then down at the bottom, scroll down a little bit, here is all of the, here's the items that he referred to, our style expression, our font color expression, and then we have our meta info expression. So this is where we would put our meta object. Good so far, Kurt?
Actually, for the meta expression, you just want contacts_LB.
Okay.
We're
oh, right. Sorry. Yep. Because we're actually calling the method. That's right.
Exactly.
Because this actually is the method that will be called when it's done. Okay.
Exactly.
So in here, I'm going to set up the form, and so in my form method, this is where I want to put in my controller code. And let's make sure I've got my onload. Okay. And that's where we build our collection.
What he just did there,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to point out what he just did there is really smart programming, you know, because 4D defaults the form to having all of these, you know, actions enabled by default. Turn them all off. Just turn them all off and turn them on as you need them.
Yeah, and a quick way to do that, if you don't know, is just a command click. We'll turn them all on and all off.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no downside to only enabling the form actions you need. Form events.
Yeah, one of the things that is new with 18, I know this caught me, is that the form event is actually changed now to a form event code. And I know I ran into issues where I was trying to use the form event and this code kept popping up. I was like, what is that? So the good old RTFM kicks in. And okay, and are we ready to, I think that was the basics. Oh, I still have to do my column. So this here is going to be in our expression. This is where the this comes in. And so as Kirk said, in the context of this, that refers to our the element of our entity selection. Look good? Here, see if I can blow it up. Woohoo! I'll always love it when it works the first time. So, ta-da! While I'm here, I'm just going to quickly touch on the example that's in there. So if you want to take a look at it, if you're coming from, like me, if you're coming from the old list boxes and going through something like this, something like this would be, a really simple example. And in my case, I set up the object instead of using the controller from inside the form. You might set up it outside the form, but when you run this, you're going to get a very simple example like this. And you've got your different, this is using the data that Kurt built. So you've got your selection list box, your array list box, and your entity selection list box. So each of these will give you an example of how these are built. And so this is simply an all records, and this is simply building an array. So actually I'll show this here so you can just quickly see the code that's being done here. Okay, selection to array, build the array, done. And then this one here is the entity selection list box. And that one, there's my debugger. Obviously the code here is substantially cleaner than like you might see in an array, but the result for all of these is exactly the same. So if you want to look at that, if you haven't used an entity selection, that'll give you an idea of what you can do with that. So okay, I'm done turning letters, Kurt.
I know okay. Guy was had a few comments about well, how do I do this with an entity selection list box, and where the heck did this go? And I mean, I know that there's certainly some differences between each of the approaches, and it's there's certainly some benefits and certainly some things that take a little bit more code here and less code there between each of the examples. Is there anything that really jumped out at you, Guy, when you're coding the same?
Well, just, yeah, I think the biggest thing is, like, especially when you're dealing with the entity selections, being able to concatenate stuff together. My brain just would never think about, looking at, when I first saw the form controller when Kirk did it, I was like, what kind of witchcraft is this? And as I use it more, I actually worked on a project where a client wanted me to do a bunch of data amalgamation, and it was so easy to do with Orda. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine how much code I would have had to write using classic 4D to do the same thing I did with Orda. And being able, learning, kind of unwiring the brain to be able to say, I can get my data store, and I can attach a query, and I can attach an order, all to the same line of code, is a bit, it almost takes an unlearning. But once you kind of, and you can, the great thing is you can dabble between both. You can do your Orda, and you can do your classic 4D, and it works. I've started to sprinkle, bits of Orda code where, kind of like when SQL first came out, you were trying to check for duplicates. And when you didn't have to, when SQL allowed you to not touch the selection, it was like, wow, this is a great way to, now I can do duplicate searching without touching my selection. And Order's the same way. I mean, you can have multiple entity selections, and, that I think is the biggest thing. And going through certainly some of the examples helps too, but, that was probably one of the ahas of that. But yeah, looking at some of this stuff is really, and if for anybody, once Kirk gets going here, if anybody hasn't tried, doing, the binding to the form, as you'll see here, it's pretty powerful stuff.
Well put. And frankly, this also kind of goes to what I'm, what Guy and I are kind of hoping that you all take away from this is just the, feeling confident enough to just go try some of this stuff, because once you get going with it, I think you're just gonna find the benefits of it. Okay, so now we're gonna get a little fancier. Instead of the trivial example that we had before, now I'm gonna work with an entity selection, and I'm gonna create a browser form with this entity selection list. We're actually not going to do the create, update, and delete stuff. I didn't want to get overly complicated. But you're going to be able to but you're going to be able to lay that in for yourself, I think, pretty easily. And then also, I'm going to define a sublist of contacts, because it's not infrequent that we have a case where you're creating a form, you need to give the user access to look up things, but you want to limit the things, you want to create a subset of the total record, either for performance reasons, although I got to say with order that has been much less of an issue, or more specifically is probably going to be for access reasons, because you want a given user doesn't have access to absolutely everything. So you want to limit what their range of options are, but then also make it a nice performant user interface. So let's look at how we're gonna do that. I created the sample data, and this is in the Git repo that you can download if you want to. There's 1,000 records in there I created from Makaru. This is what they look like. We've got a name, email, gender, phony birthday, company, an address object, and a phone object. Just some nice data. So now let's go build a form. I'm going to create and define the list box like I did before. In this case, I'm naming it contact _ 01 _ LB. This is starting to look old hat to you by now. So the list box method is going to be pretty much a duplicate of the first at this point, renaming the method, of course. And now I'm going to add a search widget, which really is just an input field. But you notice that I'm binding that to a new property of my list box object. Okay, so I'm binding this to contact _ 01 _ LB dot search. Now I habitually define these things myself, but if you don't predefine that, 4D will automatically add this as a text to that object if the user types something into it. Okay, now as I was saying, what do we want the search widget to do? Do we want to search the entire table, or data class more specifically, or do we want to use a defined list? And I want to use a defined list. So I'm going to call the defined list source, and I'm going to add .source to my list box object. And a point to remember working with ORDA is this kind of duplication may initially strike you as like, wow, I'm totally duplicating the amount of memory I'm using. But we're not, because with ORDA, we're dealing with references, and references take up a fraction of the memory that the actual data does. So this is performant, and even with a large list, I mean, there's only 1,000 names in this one. Let's say I had 10,000 names in it. This kind of duplication of putting the source list to be a reference to 10,000 names I selected out of the data class, and then simply putting that entire list also into the .data element, because .data is what's actually going to show in the form, does not increase the amount of memory that's required significantly. And it's not nothing, but it's not at all like you're probably used to. Okay, so now, sorry, I sort of messed up my keynote timing there. But what we're doing is simply running the form, and we're seeing that we have the list there. And once more, I'm going to break the fourth wall, and I'm going to go back, because this was an important slide to show. And it's this. So the search widget is, well, okay, I'm sorry. So everything is initialized there. And then we run it, and I confuse myself. Never mind. Let us continue. Here, I was simply initializing the form as we did before, and running it, and we get the big list. Now I'm going to enable the search widget. For this, I like to use the on after edit form event. And what we're looking at is the code for the actual input object. The benefit for on after edit is that then I can use this get edited text function method rather in 4D, which returns just whatever has been edited in that particular object. And this is really great. If you've already used it, I don't need to tell you why, but it's just really, really easy. It's so much easier than what we used to have to do trying to get the highlighted text to see what somebody had edited. Okay, so with this do search command that I've added to the list box controller, I'm going to hold on to whatever the edited text is by putting that in this .search property. This isn't strictly required, but again, this is just a personal habit of mine. And now I'm going to do a query and populate the .data element with a search, with a query on the .source element. And in this instance, I'm only querying on the last name. Obviously, you can make this as complicated or involved as you want. And I'm going to search on, or I'm going to query on the search string that comes from the get edited text. I'm going to add the wildcard onto it. And so what this should do now is give us a search widget that is really quick and easy. When it's cleared, because I'm appending the wildcard, it defaults to showing everything. And once more, it just works. So now let's add a detail subform. This is really a simple one. As you can see, I simply set up the input forms or the input fields to look at form dot and then the property name. So with this orientation, this form is going to display an entity if the entity is loaded into form. And this turns out to be particularly handy for setting up a subform. So I drop that form I just created into my browser form as a subform. And I make the subform itself an object. In fact, 4D defaults to an object now, and this is really a very convenient thing to do. Now, the variable expression I'm going to set to the currently selected item of the list box. So now let's watch what happens with that. So you see the subform updates itself automatically as the current item of the list box changes. And I'm not going into it, but of course, we could also be changing or editing and updating the data. When you do that, having bound the entity to the form objects as I've done here, 4D will automatically save the changes for you if it can. Now, if you need to, you can also take control of that yourself, but you have to do a little more work. The default is that 4D, if you make the subform editable and you make the fields editable, 4D is going to manage all those edits for you. And so,
is that Is that true even with entity selection, or is it primarily with collections that it automatically saves?
Well, for
Entity.
collections, there's nothing to save because you're just editing the collection exists in memory.
Right.
For the entities, and for the entities, yeah, it does attempt to save the entity. It doesn't do like the DK, the auto merge or anything fancy. It just seems to run a save.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that extends that idea then can be extended pretty easily to start including things like adding and deleting entities on your list, performing more actions on there. Another reason that you sometimes want to use the source is to also imagine a situation where you may have financial data that you're putting up. Perhaps you've got a ledger that you want to make available for the user, and you want to adopt the user interface where the user gets to make all sorts of changes, but then you want to hold them and commit them all at once. How are you going to do that if 4D is going to tend to want to save things automatically? The best workaround for that I found is that you want to put the entities you want to use toCollection to create a collection for display of the entities involved. The collection then accretes or aggregates the changes that the user wants to make. And then, from some explicit action the user takes, like clicking an OK, save this button, then you go through and you start looping through each of the collections, detect the ones that changed, and then go make those things, update the entities.
There's also a really handy method, what do you call it, member function, where you can basically query the collection for anything that you flagged as being updated. And then you can say, you can create an entity selection by saying .from collection, and it will, it's kind of like the old array to selection, except it will actually go out and find the records for you based on whatever key that you've included, or if you just do toCollection with the key will already be included in each object in the collection, and then it will automatically route itself back to the records in the database, and that's super handy.
Right.
Yeah.
So, questions? Anybody want to see something over again, or want me to take apart something?
Kirk?
Yes.
So we saw setting everything manually. We talked about this the last time you and I got together. So to take this back one step further and create forms on the fly, dynamic forms, every single one of those properties that we saw you setting can be set dynamically as well, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So all we have to do then is get to JSON, get an example of that in JSON, and then figure out how to insert the JSON. And then when we load it, all the properties that we gave it automatically are created on the screen, depending on where you put it at and stuff, right?
Yep, exactly.
So that makes it really easy to use this as an on the fly for any kind of data structure that you have then.
Well, yeah, and and the point John's making, I mean, I don't know how many of you have either worked in version 18 and specifically in project mode to see the way that 4D is managing form definitions on, in the JSON files that it creates now, or if you've used the convert to dynamic command that's available, I think is that in V17 or is that the
16R6?
Okay. Which allows you to if you're working in a binary database, it allows you to just turn that into one of those JSON forms. The great thing about those is that you can just use it with dialogue. So you can convert one of your existing forms in a binary database into this JSON file, and you could actually just move that to another database and use that file as it is simply by calling, dialog and supplying either the path to the JSON file or loading the JSON file first and then supplying the object to the dialog command. And just look up in the documentation how you do that.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, didn't mean to cut you off. Just had a question from the chat dialogue there about how the input area was tied to the selection in the list box. When a row is clicked on the list box, how is the record or how is the data filled in the input area? How is that binding set up?
Okay, let's take a look at that. So the binding is simply accomplished by the variable, by the expression. When I type into this, let me just go ahead and run this. So as I type in here, the data is bound. What causes the method to run, which perhaps is what we're really trying to get at, is the fact that I've set the form event for the input object to the on after edit. So what on after edit does is fire every time I basically change that string at all. Essentially, that's by keystroke. So when that happens, then we go to the method. And we come down to the do search. So, and let's just watch this happen. It's kind of cool. Okay, so here's $0. This is just the my list box.
Yeah. So typing in the search area loads the entity selection in the list box. When you click on the row, it essentially loads that particular selection, and that's what shows the data in the form.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood. Yeah. Yes.
So everything basically refers to the form object, which is where the data is located.
Yeah.
Not located, I guess, but bound.
Yeah. Did I answer the question? Did that answer your question?
I think it's so on the input area, the form dot first name, form dot last name. Like
how are these bound?
Right.
These are bound.
And as far as modularization goes, when you get into pro mode, you'll be using subforms, and they're awfully handy, especially when when you are leveraging this form variable, because I'm sure, as Kirk will talk about here, the form variable for a subform is the same object variable that that you bind the subform to. So
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was I did sort of gloss over this. Pardon me for that. So
oh, no worries.
here's the way. Here's what I'm doing. Creating this subform. Each of these input areas, as you see, is named form.input first underscore name, form dot first underscore last name. Basically, you know, I'm just using the field names from the table that the entity, or from the, okay, I'm using the entity names, entity property names. So the assumption this form is based on, though, is that form is going to be populated with an entity from contacts, okay? Because otherwise, what I would be doing is showing, like, here is the regular, here is the, regular is not the right word. Here's the default input form that I get if I go over here and simply look at the data. You know, if I go to the user environment and I double click on it, this is the form that's being used here. And you see it, you know, it's showing the information because it's referring directly to each of those fields. But what I'm doing here is assuming that I'm going to have the entity in form. So by putting this subform, or by putting this form on my parent form as a subform, and then define, and then the contents of the subform object, this object, I'm defining as the currently selected item on the list box, which is an entity. So we'll go back over to,
Yeah, and actually the key there is that it's the current item. So when we set up the controller and we set up the list box and said, you know, here's the position, the selected, and the current item. It's that the key there is it's the current item. So when you click on it, 4D is setting that current item, which because you've tied the list box to that current item, it shows you what's in that particular entity.
Yep. And let's see, how can I show that? Let's do this.
It's just kind of default behavior. Yeah, when you're binding it to an object, that object becomes the actual form variable for the subform, and you can reference it just by form dot field name.
Right. This is one of the things that is so different about the way we're used to dealing with 4D in the past. That you know, I had to play with it for a while as well. You know, I mean, I really like using this stuff now, but I tell you, the first few times, especially some of those early demos that they had up, I looked at those things, and even when I was going through the code, I wasn't understanding how they were doing it. So don't you know? Let me encourage you to just keep working with it, because eventually I think you're going to suddenly go, oh, I see. And here, so here we're looking at this form, contact browser. The contents of form for the browser, as Guy said, include this cur item. And as you see, this is the entity, because it tells me so. This is the entity that I have selected over here, Win Abramov. This entity is also loaded into the list box that this detail is in. And that's why form.first name in the subform is showing us the same thing as form.contact01lb.curitem.firstname. Is that helping, or am I just muddying the waters for you? Does that answer the question? Because this is a great question. I mean, this is a great question, and I want to make sure
Yeah.
Um,
There's another question along the same lines. So if you command click the selected row to deselect it, what happens with the input subform in that instance? So again, 4D automatically adjusts the selected line value for that list box, and the subform automatically reacts to that event and clears itself out.
Right. And the reason for that, and again, that's good. That's a really good question. It's good to understand what's going on here. When any of these list box expressions are not defined, they go to null, except for position, which goes to 0. Okay. So you see the cur item is null. That's actually really good because it's really easy to test for cur item equal null, or cur item does not equal null if you want to react to those selection things. Also notice that the selected expression goes to 0. It doesn't go to null, and position also goes to null. And what the selected does selected is sort of the equivalent of if you think about like an old selection list box, you have the list the user set. Well, that's what this selected collection is, or entity selection, depending on what the list box is made up of. So you see, I selected these 13 rows, and here is a that 13 rows selection, which you could just as easily have, well, I don't know, in another list box someplace on the form. You could have this, you can make a really dynamic, cool interface by having a big list of something. Got people in this case, and maybe, and I'm not imagining a list case right now, but you could have a list box that simply monitored, for example, the selected collection, and anytime that had more than one member in it, you might make you might have another list box on here that you want to display that sub-selection in for some reason. All of which you could do with a couple of lines of code. I mean, this is part of what is so cool about how quickly we can work with these things. Another question? Comment?
Yeah, there's chats, a lot of chatting going there, and one of the questions was about saving, and I think that might be a whole nother presentation onto itself. But I think by default, if you change the subform, 4D automatically saves it, right?
Yeah. So like, let's change Kathy's name to Kathy, and you notice that the entity updates right away. So this last name is Aiken. So let's close that and then rerun it so that we. And let's find a. Let's figure that.
Wayne wants to know if you've experimented with a list box class.
No, that's really the next thing that's coming.
Another presentation. Wow, they're just flying.
I was actually kind of thinking about rolling that one into this, and decided that's the habitual mistake I make about overloading how much stuff I try to present. So, but no, that is the next step after this. Obviously, is that instead of having this project method, we turn that into a class, and that even becomes more self-contained and a little more dynamic. And I'm finding putting operations like that into a class, require a little more thought when I build it, but they're just rock solid once you get them working.
And then all the names could inherit from one another, could inherit from the parent class, the super class or whatever.
Yep.
So that you'd have a better chance of keeping those the same across the board, like for the
Yeah, let me try this. I'm not sure I have the right one. Oops. Oh, okay, so it's actually not saving automatically.
No, it's updating the list box, but not.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's not saving. So I would need to write that in. You would need to write that in. I would do that by, I would do that by going down here to the subform and probably just catching the on data change.
Or you could put that code in a button on the subform. No.
Yeah, if you wanted to do it that way.
Yeah.
If
Okay.
If you want to make the changes, actually,
Like an apply button or something.
Yeah, and this is a good point. I'm not entirely sure that 4D's tendency to automatically update that stuff is always a good thing. I wish I could toggle that on and off, because the ambiguity, as this just illustrates, can bite you sometimes.
Yeah. Now that's where that refresh member function is probably handy, so that as you're clicking away from a record, you might want to refresh what's being shown in the entity selection list box.
And that's a good point, because if anybody's working with version 17 still, I believe the change was made in 17R4, where in order to update a entity selection, you had to assign the entity selection to itself. There's a little trick you had to do to refresh.
Yeah.
And I believe that was fixed in R4. Or .4. Yeah, but I mean, we're using 18 here, so but if you're still using 17, there are a few little things like that can trip you up.
Yeah, it was very awkward.
It was, baby steps. So certainly but it is, you still can dabble and, as I've done, and use snippets of code in existing projects in 17 that, solve some serious issues as far as performance and speed and having an entity selection versus adjusting your current selection. One of the places where I use it, for example, is where I assign a display order to records, for example. Now I can do that with basically, well, except for one issue, which you could do it with one line of code essentially, but that kind of, again, the order kind of thinking is where you got to kind of go for something like that. But you can sprinkle it in existing code, so don't be afraid to do that.
Right. Yeah, to get it to save, there was a comment in the chat to get it to save. Right. So the form itself
Form.save
represents the entity itself.
Yes.
And then when you do .save on the form variable, which is awfully crafty, that theoretically should work.
Yeah, that's exactly the way you would do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is very generic too. I mean, that is one of the, that again is one of the fabulous things about working with entities and the what is it? I was reading this weekend about the thing with classes and with objects is the bidirectionality between actions and data, and I'm still kind of wrapping my head around that, because it's so different from the way I've done it for so many long years, but it's extremely powerful.
All right, well, that was a great demo, you guys. Unless there's some other questions and comments, I'm gonna start the wrapping up process.
Okay, let's see. I think you have a link to the Git repo if anyone wants to download the example.
Yep. On the post on the 4DMethod site for this meeting, there's a link to the to the Git repository, as well as a link to the 4D forum post. So if you have any other questions or discussion that you'd like to have, you can either add a comment on 4DMethod, or you can add a discussion in 4D forums. Go try out the new discuss.4D something.
Oh, hey, Brent.
Yes.
Can I also throw out a pitch for, if anybody wants to stop by 4D Happy Hour on Fridays,
Ah, yeah.
we just kind of talk and hang out with each other, but it's also a lot of fun sometimes to just dive into somebody's problems or questions or new stuff anybody else finds. So
Yeah. No, it's always fun to chat with everybody. It's lighthearted, just checking in and chatting with everyone. Let's see if I can get my slides back. Let's see. Bear with me 1 second. Share screen. That one.
Yeah, forum actually might be a good spot to, if there's sort of questions, people could go to that original link and we could kind of banter back and forth there.
Yep.
Especially when the 4D scientists can kick in as well if we, stub our foot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Kirk and Guy. Very good information. It's the capabilities have come a really long ways with the list boxes and the ND selections and the collections. There's a lot to learn, a lot more to talk about for what the best way or what a good way or what any way is to show data in 4D interface. Let's see, in our next meeting that we have on our 4DMethod schedule, which can be found on the 4DMethod website under the schedule tab, we're going to have Danny Bobian back to 4DMethod to show a modern component for reading delimited text files, which will be another great demonstration of just how to use the new language capabilities for a good old task of reading delimited files. Like we'll always be doing that in applications. We also have an open scheduled date on October 7th if you want to show off some of your own code or do another roundtable. This has been a really great experience. Thanks again to Kirk and Guy for suggesting that. I think that was a great way to keep it fresh so that we could hand off between people and fill in the blanks here and there. And thanks to everyone at 4D for giving us some updates from there. If there's any other questions or discussion, obviously that we can take it up on the forum. Feedback is always appreciated if you want to email 4DMethod directly. And additional support is also appreciated. You can find some fun benefits to be had at the Patreon site. So thanks again to everybody. Sorry we went a little bit long, but hopefully I think that there's a lot of valuable stuff that we went over today. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brent.
All right.
Thanks, Brent. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.